Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Living History. And today, well, really a follow-up to a really popular podcast we did a couple of months ago about the Titanic. And in that podcast, if you haven't downloaded it, go back and check it out, because it was really something special. We discussed the history of Titanic, we discussed new discoveries that are telling us more about the wreck and about the story of Titanic, which must seriously rate as one of the most important chapters of maritime history in modern history. And today, as I said, a follow-up to that, because I was fortunate this week to speak to Dr Jay Ludowyke, and she's written a remarkable book, not about the Titanic, but about the Carpathia. And if you know your Titanic history, you'll remember that the Carpathia was the ship that steamed towards Titanic when she got the distress signal and rescued the survivors. So the 700 odd people who survived the sinking of the Titanic were rescued by the Carpathia, and that was the ship that went back to New York with these people on board. Really a remarkable part of the story that we don't hear a lot about. But it didn't end there. Carpathia then went on to a very illustrious career during the First World War and met her untimely fate right at the end of that war. So it's a really fascinating story. It's a story that we should know more about, that we don't know more about, and I was really fortunate to sit down with Jay and to have her discuss her new book all about the Carpathia. So let's hear from her now. Let's hear this incredible story of the Carpathia.
A date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General.
There's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist attack.
This was their finest hour.
Jay, thanks for taking the time. It's wonderful to have you on Living History.
Thanks very much. I was delighted to be asked.
Your book, Carpathia, it's very interesting. It's a fascinating chapter of history, and only a couple of months ago we did a podcast on Titanic, which was really popular. And obviously the history of Carpathia and Titanic are closely intertwined. What led you to discover this story and to want to write this book?
Yeah, sure. I love history, and I was about to start my Doctor of Creative Arts degree at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and I was looking for what story I actually wanted to write. I was looking for ideas that inspired me. And one evening, I was watching an episode of Antiques Roadshow. I'm a big fan of this program.
I think we all are. I am as well. It's a great show.
And someone had brought along a medal that was awarded to one of the crew members who served aboard Carpathia during the rescue mission of the Titanic survivors. And I'd never heard of this ship before, but the expert told the story of how Captain Rostron didn't hesitate, received the distress call, turned Carpathia northwest, sailed full speed ahead through pitch black night directly towards icebergs. They even diverted steam from non-essential services back to the engines, trying to wring out every drop of speed they could. And the Titanic is such a tragic story, but here was this part of it that was heroic and romantic, and it just really captured my heart, and I thought that would make a great story.
Why do you think we're so fascinated by this story of Titanic, and now by extension Carpathia? What is it about this story that just captivates so many people?
There are a lot of things. I think one of the big things is there's a certain mythos with being the largest ocean liner in the world, sunk by an iceberg on your maiden voyage. You know, that's the stuff of legend. The Titanic also carried people from New York that were among the highest social class. They were millionaires, and they were as famous as movie stars as are today. And their loss struck deep into collective memory. The survivors of the Titanic, the most recent survivor, only passed away about 10 years ago. So since that period, we've always had people there to remind us of this story. And the Titanic is actually one of the most written about topics. If you go to Titanic Belfast, there's an exhibition that shows all the movie posters and the book covers that have actually been written about this disaster. So there are many reasons, and I guess the final one I'd mention is in 1985 when Ballard discovered the wreck, we had this resurgence of interest in it as well. So she's a fascinating topic for a range of reasons.
And of course the movie that came about 10 years after that as well, which I think for a lot of people is the story of Titanic. But we're here today to talk about Carpathia, which is I love this angle that this is talking about this great chapter of history, but from a different angle as well, from this ship that I think people know somewhat about because they've heard the name Carpathia as the ship that rescued the people on the Titanic. But we're going to talk about that in your book in more detail. Did you find, just before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, did you find, when I look back on these chapters of history, these ships are more than just means of transport. They had their own personalities. They had their own aura about them. Did you find that when you were writing the book that these ships are more than just merely a means of transport?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of that actually comes through with the connections that people have with the ship and the stories that they tell about being on them. Ocean travel during this period, there was certainly the immigrant experience, which, in steerage, basic quarters, traveling to a country in the hopes of starting a new life. But then there's this opulent side to ocean traveling as well. If you look at James Cameron's movie, if you watch that movie, just the extravagance and the experience and the theatre of travelling aboard ship. So with Carpathia, there are people that tell stories about their experiences on board and the letters that were actually written by the passengers who witnessed the rescue of Carpathia. You get those senses of the connections through those as well.
Tell us a bit more about the ship itself, about Carpathia, because we know that Titanic was the most luxurious ship afloat, very fast. Was Carpathia in the same league as Titanic?
No, not at all. When she was built, she was one of the largest ships, but by the time Titanic came along, she was just considered mid-size. Titanic was built with opulence in mind. Carpathia has been called a comfortable ship. When she was first built, she was only intended for second and third class passengers. They did do a refit later for first class passengers. She was much smaller, so Titanic was, over 800 feet, Carpathia 558 feet, half the amount of decks. Titanic has 4 funnels, Carpathia has 1. So there's a vast difference in the intended audience and also just the size and the appearance of the ships.
Okay, and well, let's talk about the most well-known aspect of Carpathia's life was the rescue of Titanic. Just take us back to that cold, dark night in 1912. What was going on at the time?
Well, sure. Howard Cotton was the wireless operator aboard Carpathia. He'd just run the day's log up to the bridge and he missed Titanic's first distress call. He'd returned to the wireless shack at the stern of the ship and he was just getting ready for bed. He had his headphones on and was waiting to hear from another ship he'd contacted earlier in the evening when he remembered he'd received or he'd heard messages from Cape Race directed towards Titanic. And he'd had communications with Titanic earlier in the day. So he thought, while I'm waiting to hear from the Parisian, let me just tell Titanic there's messages from Cape Race. And the reply that he got from Titanic was a CQD, all stations distress. Come quick, we've hit a iceberg.
The CQD, that was the distress call, wasn't it? In the days before SOS.
So it was the equivalent of SOS. So they did have SOS, but it had just sort of come in during that, very briefly in the period before. So he rips off his headphones and he runs up to the bridge and he reports to the officer of the watch. And then they both go downstairs through the chart room and burst into the captain's cabin. And in his memoir, Arthur Rostron says he thought, what cheeky beggars bursting into the captain's quarters without knocking. And as soon as he heard, he didn't hesitate. He ordered the officer Dean, to go back up and turn the ship northwest. And then he said to Howard Cotton, are you sure it's Titanic? And he said, yes, I am. So he calls all his officers together and he issues this litany of orders: swing out the lifeboats, open the gangways, prepare ladders and rope swings, canvas bags to pull up the children. He tells the doctors, prepare the saloons, as makeshift hospitals. There should be brandy, warm blankets. It's a host of orders that he gives them, and then his officers all go off to carry out these orders. And he also tells them keep it from the passengers, because he doesn't want the passengers to get in the way of the crew preparations when they're preparing to receive potentially thousands of people, because at that point they only knew Titanic needed help. They didn't actually know she was sinking. So when they started this voyage, they started with the expectation that they would be going to rescue, everybody that was aboard.
It seems a fairly far-sighted approach from the captain of Carpathia at that stage, to be preparing. They hear a distress signal in the dark of night, and to make all those preparations. It seems that he was fairly far-sighted in the actions that he did, and potentially that led to the saving of many lives. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, I would say that was the case, but it's probably also important to remember that by the time you're appointed a captain of an ocean liner, you have probably decades of experience, as a sailor and an officer. So he would have known the preparations that needed to be given in that situation. And I'm certain there were things that captains would have considered, because if there's a ship in distress, the only other help for them at that time is other ships. So yes, he was a very astute person, but it was also his job to know how to do these things.
So the situation is they received this distress call. How far away from Titanic were they at this stage?
It's actually interesting. At the time, the distance that Captain Rostrom worked out was that they were 58 miles away, because he used his position and the position that Titanic had actually given in the distress call. And he testifies at the Board of Trade inquiry that the ship actually went 17.5 knots and she was rated 14-knot ship. And this is where this legend of how fast Carpathia comes, because they worked out to cover 58 miles in the 3.5 hours that it took, they got 17.5 knots. But the reality was, when Titanic's wreck was actually discovered, it was actually much closer to Carpathia's position than was originally believed. So it was only about 47 miles between them. But we didn't know this until, the middle of the 80s. So that speed, that distance that he covered in 3.5 hours, it's probably only somewhere in the region of about 15.5 knots. But we should remember that, they were pushing the ship as faster than she'd gone before. So
the ship is steaming towards where they received this distress signal from. And what happens next? I assume they came across lifeboats. They come across wreckage in the water. What did they come across?
Well, what they would have expected to see was evidence of a large ocean liner. So they would have expected to see in the distance a ship with brightly lit deck lights or navigation lights. And what they saw as they were approaching was a green light on the horizon, which they actually took to be one of her navigation lights. And they'd received a message, and it was the last message they'd had from the Titanic, which was that the engine rooms were full up to the boilers. And that's full up with water. And so when they got that, that was dire. And they saw this green light and they had this sense of renewed hope. But it turned out that was actually a light that one of the officers in the lifeboats had. So when they arrived on Titanic's coordinates, they hadn't seen any brightly lit, they hadn't seen the deck lights. They by now realised that, they potentially didn't want to say it, but they were probably looking for lifeboats by this stage. And it was still dark, so they couldn't see all of the lifeboats in the water, but they could see the green light. And they actually were steaming full speed towards the green light when they almost collided with an iceberg themselves.
Wow, it's treacherous conditions.
Yeah, it was. The captain had posted extra lookouts, and they'd been avoiding icebergs through this dash towards Titanic's position. But for whatever reason, perhaps they're distracted by that light, sailing towards it, and they came within a few hundred meters of it and had to veer sharply away.
Imagine the disaster being compounded with the loss of another ship. It doesn't bear thinking about. So they took on the survivors. I think it was about 700 people they rescued from the water.
Yeah, so they did a count at 705, and the official count today is 712. There were some corrections later on. Yeah, so after they took on that first lifeboat, dawn broke and they saw the other lifeboats scattered over the water amidst this, and the descriptions of it in passengers' letters are just amazing. They call it these forts and castles and palaces of ice in this ice field, because it was literally, they were surrounded by icebergs. The captain actually sent one of the junior officers up to the top of the wheelhouse and told him to count the icebergs of varying heights.
And that must have been, once these people are on board, they're wet, they're cold, they've lost loved ones. Most of them would have lost loved ones. That must have been, in terms of this story that we know so much about, that's a chapter that we don't know very much about at all. And it was one of the parts of the book I enjoyed reading the most about, was the reactions of these people after they'd been through this disaster, the reactions of the passengers who were already on board Carpathia and who were trying to help them. You wrote wonderful accounts of women donating clothing, and you even mentioned there wasn't a lot of need for masculine clothing because there weren't a lot of men that were safe, but that passengers on board Carpathia donating clothing, doctors treating wounded and injured people. Tell me more about that period, because it was several days before the survivors were delivered back to New York, wasn't it? Yeah, and so what was going on the ship in those days?
So the drama of the rescue isn't where the story ends. They picked up the survivors on the morning of the 15th, and they didn't arrive back in New York until the evening of the 18th. So those days on the ship were fraught with both overwhelming grief and incredible generosity and compassion and human spirit. In the book, I think one of the hardest moments was when Carpathia turned away from the place the Titanic sank and actually had to return to New York. And some of the survivors were still clinging to these hopes that some other lifeboats had been picked up, but that just, they were unrealistic hopes. Picked up by other ships, that is. And in the face of their grief, Carpathia's passengers responded by giving up their cabins or bunking with other passengers, or sleeping on tabletops or deck chairs, donating their clothes. One woman said she gave her only good suit. And I often think a lot of the survivors were women that were incredibly wealthy, that would have had everything had they returned to land, but had nothing on this ship. And they were receiving the generosity from people who were far less fortunate than them in life. And I remember, one woman, Emma Hutchinson, was on her honeymoon with her husband, and they didn't tell any of the survivors that they were honeymooners because they didn't want them to feel guilt that honeymooners had given up their cabin for these people who'd faced such tragic circumstances. There was also a person by the name of Carlos Hurd. He was a reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and he had connections with a paper in New York. And as a newsman, he wanted to write this story. So he was interviewing a lot of the survivors. It was pure coincidence that there was a journalist aboard Carpathia. And he says that he didn't bother those people that wanted to talk, but for a lot of people, they needed to actually talk. And it was actually interesting because he wanted to use the wireless to transmit his message to shore, and the captain wouldn't let him. The captain was very protective of the passengers. He didn't want them bothered by people who were seeking stories, and he said they need their time to grieve and to not be bothered by these other things. And so he tried to bribe the wireless officer. He was unsuccessful. The captain had given strict orders. And in the end, he got his story to shore, because as the Carpathia was coming into New York and sailing up the Hudson, she was met by a flotilla of press boats, because they'd been trying to get this news from Carpathia. And although the captain had sent one press message with the basic details, they wanted the stories, and they wanted the passengers to give them the stories and the survivors. And they hadn't had anything, so they were clamoring for news. So Carlos Hurd is standing at the deck of Carpathia with his story wrapped in a waterproof bundle that the captain won't let him send. And the fellow that he'd met days previously from the New York World was on a tugboat, and he throws the story over Carpathia's side, and it catches and it gets tangled in one of the ropes that were suspending Titanic's lifeboats.
Wow.
Yeah. So one of the crew members actually has to climb out, and he probably doesn't even know what he has, and there's passengers lining the rails at Carpathia's deck, and they probably didn't know what was in it either, but they were chanting, throw it, throw it. And Charles Chapman, the editor, is down on the tug, and he's got a megaphone, and he's chanting, throw it, and then he throws the story over the side. And before Carlos Heard and his wife Catherine, who helped him write this story, before they set foot on shore, they've already run out the first edition of the story.
Wow,
So.
it's just, well, this was the first, this was a very early world news breaking story, wasn't it? Everyone wanted to know about this. It was unheard of, the loss of this ship, so I can understand why there was this desperation to know the full story.
I can understand both positions, the captain and Carlos's, but one felt there was a duty to tell the story, one felt there was a duty to protect the passengers. So diverging interests, but that doesn't necessarily mean that either of those interests were wrong.
Well, it sounds like they both did a great job at the end of the day. Let's go on from Carpathia, because the story doesn't begin and end with Titanic, obviously. Carpathia then served during the First World War as a troop transport, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. She carried cargo and troops, American and Canadian troops. So from United States and Halifax, she took them over to England, and from there they would go over to the front.
Until 1918, when it all went very wrong for Carpathia. Tell us about the sinking of the ship.
Yeah, she was unfortunate. It was just a few months before the end of the war, and she was in Liverpool. She'd been there a few weeks. She was waiting for other ships of a similar speed so that they could form a convoy to return to the United States. They were also waiting for an escort. So the ships coming over had very heavy naval escorts the entire way because they were full of troops and supplies. But returning back, they were empty ships, and the escorts would only protect them through sort of the southwest approaches where the U-boats were hunting. So on the morning of the 17th, Carpathia is in a convoy. Half the convoy detaches to go to the Mediterranean. The naval escort departs, and the 7 remaining westbound ships are continuing on, when just after 9 in the morning, 2 torpedoes slam into Carpathia's port side, one into her engine room and one just aft of that. After the captain gives the order to abandon ship, the passengers and crew take to the lifeboats in this exact same manner that it would have been on Titanic. Lifeboats are filled and then they're lowered, and they row away from Carpathia, and the captain's the last to leave, Captain William Prothero at this time. He destroys all the important documents that they don't want the Germans to have before he too abandons ship. The submarine was U-55. It was commanded by Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm Werner. And eventually, when Carpathia was still afloat, about an hour or so after those first torpedoes, they sent another one in, and she went down quickly after that. So went down at the bow, and that bow slams into the ocean bed, and the stern then, slowly follows. The people in the lifeboats, they wouldn't have known it at the time, but they were incredibly lucky that they didn't die. The only people that died during Carpathia's sinking were 5 firemen and trimmers who were killed in the blasts and the flooding from the initial torpedo strikes. And those people, I always like to say their names, because before I wrote the book, I couldn't find those names anywhere. I had to find them at Tower Hill Memorial. So there was James Murphy and Charles Hughes and Reginald Alfred Peters and Frank O'Neill and Edward David Hamilton, who was only 19. And those are the men that died when Carpathia sank. And the people in the lifeboats, they had reason to fear the captain of U-55. Just a few months previously, he'd sunk a cargo ship by the name of Belgian Prince, and the people there the crew had abandoned into lifeboats. And after the Belgian Prince went down, captain of U-55 took the survivors from the lifeboats onto the deck of the submarine. He sank their lifeboats, he took away their life jackets, and then he submerged the submarine.
My goodness.
And there were only a few survivors. And this is the person commanding the submarine approaching the survivors of Carpathia. And their wireless system had actually been damaged when Carpathia was initially struck by the torpedo. So they'd used signal flags to contact one of the other ships, the other convoy ships who were fleeing, because they were unarmed. They were targets as well. And Tenasserim had actually sent out a distress call on their behalf. So one of the boats that was from the naval escort that had departed that morning actually returned. And she saw the lifeboats and the surface submarine in the distance, and she started firing shells over the top of the lifeboats, protecting them from afar, forced the submarine to dive. So when she actually arrives, she races past the lifeboats to where the submarine went down, and then she's circling, dropping depth charges.
Gee, it's gripping stuff, these chapters of history. It's what I love about new books like yours, is that we think we know the story of Titanic. We probably do know the story of Titanic inside and out. There's not much more to learn. Carpathia was such an important part of that whole story, but then there's so much more history to do with this ship. It's just really... Absolutely. It's really incredible stuff.
Yeah, and we've only talked about the historical part. And, half the book is about finding the shipwreck and diving the shipwreck.
Well, that's what I wanted to talk to you about now, because the story of Carpathia, there's a long pause for almost 100 years. And as you say, this is a key part of the book. And it's interwoven very cleverly, the story of the modern search for the wreck and disappointments and then discovery. Tell us about what went on in the decades that followed and the eventual discovery of Carpathia.
I think she was for a long time forgotten about. After the rescue of the Titanic, I would say she was just as famous as Titanic. The captain received all these accolades. She was visited by over 100,000 people after she resumed her voyages. But over time, we've remembered the Titanic tragedy because it was so enormous. We haven't really remembered that story of heroism. And then Clive Cussler, who obviously has a strong interest in all things maritime, he thought, what happened to the ship that rescued the survivors of the Titanic? And he went looking for it. So he funded expeditions through the organisation that he founded, NUMA, National Underwater and Marine Agency. And there were a few failed attempts, but they did eventually locate Carpathia. And that story is interesting in and of itself, the way that they were actually able to find the ship. Was by asking help from local fishermen. Where have your nets caught up, on potential wrecks in a search area that they were basing on the coordinates given by U55, where they had sunk Carpathia. The coordinates by the vessel that rescued them was called Snowdrop, and also where Captain Prothero had put his ship down. But that is a large area to search, and they were trying to find, where in this area could she be? And it was actually some fishermen who gave them potential places to search that led to them finding the wreck.
What year was it that they discovered the wreck?
So they discovered the wreck in the year 2000.
Okay, fairly recently then.
Yeah, so not long ago at all. And it was interesting because when they eventually found the wreck, they found it in May. And they sent down a rover, but they had technical difficulties, so the rover shorted out the umbilical cord, so they couldn't actually identify it, and it remained this mystery wreck until they were able to go back months later and take a rover down and identify it. But as soon as the announcement that Carpathia had been found made its way into the world, she became an object of interest for divers in the UK. And I'm not talking about your ordinary recreational divers, I'm talking about technical divers, because Carpathia lies over 500 feet down, and there's only a very few people in the world who are skilled enough and, let's say, daring enough to actually dive that deep. And I was fortunate because I made contact with Rick Waring, who led an expedition in 2007, comprised of a team of British, German, and Italian divers who actually dived Carpathia's wreck, and the stories they have to tell are just amazing. One of the men who's dived Carpathia's wreck told me his wife made him write his will before she let him go. So I mentioned Rick, but there was the whole team, an amazing group of men.
You said daring, these tech divers. I've had a little bit to do with them as well over the years, and I think crazy is another word that applies to them as well. Their enthusiasm knows no bounds, and they certainly see these deep dives as a challenge to be taken on. They
do indeed, and I don't think I would even be the type of person to dive normal recreational diving, and to go so deep. it takes guts, and in the just in the first chapter, I call them what they are. They're brave, in my opinion. And I heard someone call them reckless the other day. But we say crazy and we say reckless, and I think maybe there is an element of crazy, but what they do, they have to be so precise and so careful. So I would never apply those words lightly, because Rick, for example, his partner Lynn, she told me he can be a bit scatty sometimes, but never when it comes to diving, because if they get something wrong, when they're 500 feet under the water and there's 6 hours of decompression between them and the surface, getting something wrong could cost them their lives. So they're daring, and maybe they're a little bit crazy, but they're damn careful too.
It's just extraordinary stuff, and it's a wonderful final chapter to the Carpathia story, that there's now these teams of dedicated divers going down to explore her further and really finish telling that story. Just the book is extraordinary. I really enjoyed it, and I've really enjoyed speaking to you, Jay. Just tell me, what's the one thing about Carpathia that surprised you during this journey as you're putting the book together and learning these stories? What was something about it that just surprised and captivated you as the author of this book?
The preface of the book is one of my favourite parts of the book. Whenever I was reading the very brief accounts of Carpathia's rescue, there'd often be a few lines that mentioned, while the Carpathia was being built, part of Wallsend had been uncovered in the shipyard at the same time. And Wallsend is part of Hadrian's Wall. It's the very end of a 2,000-year-old wall built by the Romans to mark the edge of the frontier. It really intrigued me, this idea of something that was so old being uncovered when Carpathia was brand new, but now to us she's a historical artifact, and there were all these beautiful resonance with history and our connection to it. So I thought I would love to find out more about this excavation and craft a scene when she's being built and when these stones are being uncovered. And this is just something as a writer that I thought would be good for the story. And long story short, I was put in touch with an archaeologist and a Roman scholar who was able to tell me he had seen an account in an old book that actually said that stones from Wallsend had actually been placed aboard Carpathia in a glass case in the saloon. And here was I creating these intangible connections and then finding physical evidence. And so I tracked down the source, and I was talking to him, and his name is Dr. Mike Bishop, and he said, but I've never seen photographic evidence to support it. And it didn't occur to me at the time that I had seen photographic evidence to support it. And the next day after we'd had this conversation by email, I was at the Tyne and Weir archives, and I was holding the originals of photos that I'd seen months before, and I was looking at a photo of the library. And you would never know what it was unless you were looking at it. But there's a glass case sitting on a bookshelf with a little plaque above it, and what looks very much like stones in it. And I sent it to Dr. Bishop, and I said, what do you think? And he said, it's the right size and shape to be stones. So to find that evidence, that in conjunction with the book that says, there were stones aboard Carpathia, to actually be able to create and find evidence of that connection is one of my sort of favorite things. And in the story that I told, she didn't go down with gold bullion or chests full of jewels as we think, shipwrecks and sunken treasure. But for me, these stones, these elements of the past were the treasure that sunk with her. And that's one of my favorite parts of the book.
It's a wonderful story. And like so many of these stories we delve into, just so many layers of wonderful history. I mean, I think the more you dig into this, the more you can discover and the more wonderful stories that will come out. But speaking of wonderful stories, the book is fantastic. It's a really interesting account of Titanic from a perspective we don't normally see. And the story of the Carpathia is great in its own right as well. So the book is available now Australia-wide. So go out and get it. It's called Carpathia by Jay Ludowyke. And Jay, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. It was wonderful.